Hello everybody, my name is Peter Hurst. I'm the Executive Director of Executive Education at the MIT Sloan School. As every year, it's a real pleasure for me to be here and get an opportunity to introduce one of our keynote speakers. I will do that in a moment, and you're in for a real treat. Before that, a couple of things. One thing is, so I hope that you've all been asking good or better questions today after this morning's keynote. And I have one, I hope, good question for you all, which is, how great are Jack and Jeremy and the volunteer team? I think this is the best event of its kind in the world, frankly. I'm happy that we're able to be part of it, and let me tell you how smart I think you all are for coming to this, but you know that already. One other order of business that I have, there is a little slight commercial announcement. Hopefully all of you have had a chance to visit our booth outside MIT Sloan Executive Education. If you did, then you will know that if you would like to come to any of our short courses at the MIT Sloan School and non-degree exec ed courses, we have a special discount for those attending this program of 15%. Julie will be on the desk outside. The other announcement I'd like to make is if you visited the booth, you know that we had a drawing for a free 2-day course. And let's hope the person I've been handed the winning card, Bruce Barshevsky from ServiceNet. Anybody here? Great. So we'll get in touch by email later to send you the details. So now it's really my honor and my great pleasure and privilege to introduce you our keynote speaker. And I think probably for this whole audience, this is somebody who needs no introduction, so I can probably keep it quite short. But let me say, one of the delights of getting to work at MIT is that we're constantly surrounded by living legends. And this afternoon's speaker, I think, is just it's a prime example of one of the living legends of MIT. Nicholas Negroponte has MIT literally in his blood, you might even say in his DNA. He's an alumnus, like many of you are. He joined the faculty in 1966. Within just 1 year of joining the faculty, he started what at that time was a really forward-thinking and innovative initiative around the use of computing in architecture. And really that kind of drive for innovation has been a hallmark of his entire career, both at MIT and outside MIT, and I'm sure you've all read about many aspects of that. But one of the things that he's probably most famous for around MIT is being one of the co-founders of the MIT Media Lab. And his impact on the world has been magnified so much, not only because of his own personal contributions, but as I think about even the people that I've seen in the 7 or 8 years I've been around MIT that have an opportunity to be exposed to completely new and innovative and bold ways of thinking and doing and making things happen at the Media Lab, and how that MIT alumni diaspora has gone out into the world and created countless businesses, generated wealth, generated jobs, generated actually public good. And in fact, as I look at those, I realize that many of those initiatives, many of those businesses, many of those technologies, there's something which is a theme that runs through them, a thread, and that's, you all know that are associated with MIT. We're a very mission-driven organization. People at MIT are at MIT in part to try to change the world. I hope you all here feel that you're being a little bit part of that right now. But here this afternoon, we have an opportunity to actually not hear about that from someone who's a bit of a newcomer and an observer of that, but actually to hear from someone who's been doing this at MIT for many decades and out in the world. And I know that you're in just for an amazing treat right now, and I'd like to invite to the stage Professor Nicholas Negroponte.
Thank you. Those introductions are always a rude reminder that I've been at MIT. I'm in my 55th year. And when I came up the steps on Mass Avenue, I thought I was going to be at MIT for 4 years and leave. and I never did, which is kind of the exact opposite of what I advise students to do, to go and do many things and try things. And yet I stayed at MIT because it was an absolutely excellent platform. And what I'm going to talk about today derives from the things I did. So excuse me if I indulge in a few reminiscences, but one of the reasons the Media Lab existed, or was allowed to exist, is that I had a partner. People see that I'm listed as the co-founder, but very few people know who the other co-founder was. And it was Jerry Wiesner, who was president of MIT. And let me assure you that if you co-found something, co-found it with the president. Because there are no speed limits. And when you're speeding down the Mass Pike at twice the speed limit, and an officer stops you and sees you have a gorilla in the front seat, says, "Excuse me, sir, please continue." So for the 5-6 years of sort of imagining it, building the first building, opening the lab, it was quite frictionless, partly because of Jerry, but partly because the constituent parts of the Media Lab had nobody else at MIT claiming them. This is a very important detail because other people have tried to do things like the Media Lab at other universities, and it's not succeeded. Partly because if you take I'll use the Media Lab groups, there was a film video group. But there isn't a film school at MIT. There was a news group, but we don't have a journalism school. There was an education group, and we don't have an ed school. There was a graphic design group, and we don't have an art school. You could go right down the list of all the people who were the founders of the Media Lab, and there was no school. Not only was there no school or department that claimed them, in many cases, the faculty were rejects from their department. I remember going to see the provost at the time and saying, I would love to include Seymour Papert in the Media Lab. And he said, bless your heart. You know, I was taking Seymour off his hands. And it was a real salon des refusés, and people thought it was all icing and no cake. We went through that for about 5 years, and then people started to realize maybe there was some cake. And I can talk to you about it for hours, but I'm now going to sort of flash forward, and for today, when I was asked to talk to this group, I tried to think to myself, what is it that I might share with you that is, in some cases, the opposite of what you might think or believe, or at least thought before and maybe not think after the talk. And it all comes from the difference between a mission and a market. And when I wake up in the morning, I ask myself one question: will normal market forces do what I'm doing today? And if the answer is yes, then stop. Don't do it. Because normal market forces will do it, and they'll probably do it just fine. So that what I felt my job, and I'm being perhaps a little revisionist, but my job is to do what normal market forces won't do, because actually market forces are really bad for most of the things that matter. Most of the things that you care about in life, market forces do a really bad job. And so I'm going to share with you one primary story, but there are a couple of other things in the beginning that I'll go through. And I will, throughout, try and emphasize two very unpopular opinions. One is that civic society is there for a reason. Civics and civic responsibilities cannot be made up for by the private sector. And in fact, I even think most so-called public-private partnerships are rubbish. That civic society has a responsibility that it should do, and you see this in education, where venture capitalists get into education and treat it as a market. It's not. So that'll be sort of my main theme. And competition fails in many, many cases. We always think competitiveness is such a good thing. And national competitiveness, which is, to me, the most revolting concept on the planet, because I don't have a nationalistic bone in my body. And when somebody talks about national competitiveness, what are they talking about? National collaboration may be the measure that we should be doing, because otherwise the world is just going to continue to be all divided in these rather unattractive parts, which, by the way, have gotten worse, not better, in the past few years. So I'll give examples of where competition fails. Education is at the top. Some of telecommunications, it fails. And I will also, as a theme, and I'm slipping in a little side stories. One is there's a new brain drain that we don't recognize. Now, I have personally funded 65 startup companies. So I'm not against funding startup companies. But what's happened today, which I'd never imagined 40 years ago, is that the startup mania that we have partly created in our innovation and entrepreneur programs is such that very few of our students go out and work on big, hard problems. They do stupid little apps and turn them into companies. Okay, there's a lot of that going on, and it's incredible. And we're not only complicit in having it going on, we're advocating this. And we're having, and the Media Lab graduates in rough numbers. It doesn't matter if this is even accurate in total, but let's say 50 students, masters and PhDs a year. You used to be able, at least I used to be able to think, well, out of those 50, 25 are going to work on hard, long-term problems, like nuclear fission. I mean, things like really big, long-term problems. Now it's 2, and everybody else is doing their startup. So there is a brain drain that's going on. It'll change, it'll swing back, but it's not normally described that way. The other thing is this is referred to, but I don't think anybody has a grasp of how consumption's going to go down. This is a post-ownership society of such a monumental level that we are a little bit, out of touch. And I'm sure some of you are in consumer CFO companies and consumer, but people are going to buy your stuff less and less and less. Cars at the top of the list. And we don't, just by way of an example, a faculty member, and you could say this is a rarefied environment, a faculty member asked a group of about 30 students in his class recently, how many of you want to own a car? Not one hand went up, not one. Okay. When I was that age, I wanted to have a car. It was freedom, it was liberation. Hell, it was where you had sex, was on a car, okay? Now you have it in your parents' house. The point is it's different. And the need for a car is very, very different. And Uber, I mean, you can just Uber around. So there is a post-ownership era, which is part of, to me, it's really good news, and it's part of some of the things I'll talk about afterwards. And I think suburbs, here I am, we're standing in a suburb. I don't know any young person who wants to or will live in a suburb. Just don't know it. I don't know. I haven't met one. Now, maybe they know what I'm asking when I ask it, so they won't admit it, but they're not going to live in the suburbs. They're going to live in the city, because that's where the vitality is, that's where the other people are, that's where the so on and so forth. And many of our, most of you are much younger, but many of us thought of going, I never did, but thought of going to the suburbs because it was safer. We have this ridiculous education system based on real estate taxes, so they're kind of better there too. And the safety, the pollution, all of this stuff will go live in the suburbs. Well, that's over. That's completely the past, not the future. So these things are lurking, and while I'm going to talk mostly about learning and education, they're sort of lurking in the background, and I think they're very big trends. So my sort of mission at the moment is to connect the last billion people. And the last billion is very different than the next billion. And this is an argument that, or a discussion, I should say, I have with Zuckerberg and others. The next billion people is a little regulatory change, some pricing changes, you can do some things and you're going to get the next billion people on the internet by clicking your finger. The last billion is a technical problem. It's very hard. There's no electricity. There's just so many things that you have to think about it very, very differently. And the way I've been thinking about it recently, and only recently, only in the past 6 months, and I find people listen to the story differently, and that is to think of connectivity as a human right. And when you talk to somebody, you say, well, maybe connectivity is a human right. Whether they agree with you or not doesn't matter. It just puts it in a different plane. Because if connectivity is a human right, the only thing you have to do is be human to qualify. And so that suddenly not only means that we should be doing the last billion very quickly, but it just changes the way, and you'll see why in a moment, but it changes the way you think about how you would roll out the technology and the infrastructure and how you might deploy it. So my work in this area goes back to the period when the Media Lab was conceived. The corporation of MIT had agreed to do it. Jerry Wiesner had just stepped down as president. We had broken ground to build the building, those of you who know the old Media Lab building. And I was attracted by Sheikh Yamani, whom you might remember from the early OPEC days, to go to Paris and start a center that would help developing nations leapfrog the industrial process in order to develop without building roads and factories and so on. Well, I thought that was a perfectly plausible idea. I went to set it up while we were building the lab, and we worked in 3 countries, Pakistan, Senegal, and Colombia. And this photograph is from Senegal at the time, in Dakar. And this young girl didn't speak English or French, but she played that Apple keyboard like a piano. And she didn't have anybody who could really explain too much to her. And it sort of got our attention, and this was Seymour Papert at the time. It caught our attention, but took then about 20 years for us to sort of realize what we really were seeing at the time. But Seymour's contribution, which dates back to 68, 69, was simply that if children that age wrote computer programs, it would enable them to think about thinking, which is very important. It's very different than teaching somebody. And thinking about thinking happens because since you're writing the program, you're, if you will, taking an algorithm, you're putting it into statements, you're executing that. And one of the things that happens in computer programming is you never get it right the first time. And it does something crazy on the screen. And the kid looks at it and figures out how to debug the program, goes in, changes a few lines, re-executes it. And what's happening, and this is the fascinating part, is what's happening is that the child is experiencing in a very real way the closest approximation to observing learning. The child is really learning about learning because what the child's doing with the program, executing, iterating, looking at the behavior, changing it, executing, is effectively one characterization of learning. And so we found that kids at very young ages were able to do things that completely changed the way you thought about education back in 1982 and in places, particularly places like Senegal, Pakistan, and Colombia. So flash forward almost 20 years, and I became involved. The Media Lab had now existed for almost 20 years, operationally for 7 years. We opened our, 17 rather, we opened our doors for business in '85. And I ran it for about 20-something years. And as I was doing it, I had sort of various side projects. I was one of the founders of Wired Magazine. I was one of the founders, or I guess the founder of this project that was in Cambodia. And it was basically what had been done in Senegal almost 20 years earlier, but now done in a computational environment where these things were affordable and less expensive than they were, even though we're using an Apple II in Senegal. That wasn't indicative of what it would cost to do a whole nation. And in this particular example, what we discovered is that the kids who owned these laptops, because they were given them for keeps, would take them home and use them at night. There was no electricity in this village, no connectivity. And the parents, all of them illiterate, loved it because it was the brightest light source in the house. And when I looked at this, literally the picture, when I went to that school, I asked myself that very question that I said in the beginning: what will normal market forces not do? And what normal market forces wouldn't do is change the cost of that damn laptop. You knew telecommunications was going to go down. You knew there was going to be electricity in the village. You knew all these things. But there was this little nuclear war going on between Microsoft and Intel, where one would make a faster processor and the other would use all of it. And then it would just go back and forth. And you finally, many years later, would have a lot more computation. But the truth was the startup took longer. The user really didn't get directly, at least the sense of much change. And we said, well, can we break that can we break the trend, and can we do the one thing that market wasn't doing at the time, and take that laptop, which averaged over $1,000 then, and bring it down to 100? And people, tons of articles saying, yeah, they never brought it down to 100. Well, we brought it down to 130, which isn't too bad. And then if you look at what the dollar did after we said we'd go to 100, and you repriced everything to the dollar value at that time, we actually went below 100. So it's a little bit of how you price the dollar. So that was when I started one laptop per child. I don't want to spend too much time on one laptop per child, except that the photographs are gorgeous, so I'll whiz through some of them. But at this point, when I left MIT, I took a long leave of absence, far longer than you're supposed to do. Henry Kissinger had to go back to Harvard because he had taken a shorter leave. And MIT seemed to be very happy to park me outside. So I spent about 5 years doing one laptop per child. And the little known fact about it is that 5 years we spent $1 billion. And the reason I mention that is because it was a very big project. And what made it big is that there were 3 million laptops, average $200 if you can manufacturing, delivery, installation. Just multiply 3 million times 200, and you're already up at the $600 million level. And you add some research, and you add the other stuff. So it was a very big project. And when we started it, we built prototypes, still sort of half in MIT, half out of MIT. And this is the one that we first built. And everybody remembers, at least who saw it, the pencil yellow crank on the side. And I made a decision then that it would be a nonprofit. All my friends advised me. Otherwise, said no. should make a profit-making company. And I said, no, I want to be nonprofit for a variety of reasons. But one of them is that you can get different partners. So Kofi Annan was our partner. We launched it in Tunis in 2005, and he's quite amazing. It was a room, actually almost exactly the size of this room, with TV cameras, just wall to wall. There was, and they were all there for him, not for me. And one of the people in the audience, or one people behind the TV cameras, said, Kofi Annan and Nicholas Negroponte, crank your computers. So we dutifully shut our laptops and put them on the side of the table, and we start cranking, and the crank falls off in his hand. Okay. Now, he's such a cool cucumber, he didn't even look down. He was turning the crank as if it was attached to the thing, holding the little yellow handle in his thing, smiling away, whereas most people would go, yeek, I broke it or something. No, he just did that. And I'm not sure too many people knew the handle had broken. But that launched the project, got it going, and then, without going into too much of the detail, the part that interested me were the transformations. I actually went to this village later, met this teacher, and this teacher had never seen computers, had never, even thought of being involved with computers in his classroom in his primary school. And instead, he ran a very, very rote, disciplined sort of corporal punishment as part of the education, little whip by his side, ask a question, and you get a little smacking sound in the air if you get it wrong. So all the kids are sort of terrified, little stone kids sitting in these perfect lines. And this is the way he taught very soon thereafter. So you get these impacts. This is in the Aboriginal parts of Australia, Peru, Afghanistan, again Peru, Nepal, and so on. Now, what happened was the following. 2 or 3 countries, Uruguay being perhaps the best, and Peru the second, or maybe Rwanda the second, and Peru the third, if the country rolled it out in a massive way, it really did work. And it's still, to this day, in Uruguay, is a very, very important piece of Uruguayan culture. In fact, every child in Uruguay from the age of 5 to 20 now has a laptop. Every single one of them. And it's so taken for granted. A friend of mine recently visited a very poor village, seaside village, a fishing village, and went into the hut of one of the families, and the mother had 6 children, and five of them had laptops running a little local area network in this hut that had dirt on the floor, and the 6th child was going to become 5 that year and get her or his, I forget which, laptop. And so really, it was all, everybody just took this for granted, and who knows 5, 10 years from now how this will have an impact on Uruguayan society. So as this was unfolding and sort of got enough momentum to have a life of its own, I said to myself, okay, that project is going on. Let me do something much, much smaller, something so small that I can fund it myself, and it's really an experiment. It's the opposite of doing a billion-dollar project, and it's an experiment that, again, is sort of very much about the mission, not about the market. And the experiment was in villages now that were so primitive that there was truly no literacy. It wasn't just like the Cambodian village that it was very poor, but to go to places that hadn't seen words, that written words were not in, there were no road signs, there was no printed matter. The closest, and a couple of people have sort of questioned me afterwards when I say that and said, well, they found some text in the label of one of the kids' shirts, and so I guess, yes, there might be a few letters, but they we're in a society with no electricity, no telephone, no literacy, and the adults for sure. And what we did there is drop off in the village the tablets, basically in closed boxes with no instructions and no people. And somebody went into the village the night before they were dropped off with a solar panel and taught an adult how to connect this, basically to put the solar panel outside. I mean, that was really the major message. And then connect it to a car battery, and the kids figured out the rest. And the one difference is that the tablets that were in the boxes were hot. And by that I mean that when you turned them on, they recorded when it was on. When you touched them, recorded what was being touched, how long you spent, in that app, took a picture of you periodically. And so the tablet was monitoring each child that was using it. There were as many tablets as there were children in the village. And so we could send somebody into the village once every 2 weeks and swap SIM cards. So we were able to track exactly what the kids were doing. And in 5 days, the kids were using 50 apps per child per day. They were using the tablets for 7 hours a day. Within 10 days, they were singing ABC songs. And within 6 months, they hacked Android. And we know which kid did it, we know what they hacked, and we know why they hacked it. And in fact, I thought it was kind of stupid on our part to fence off the camera, but that's what they realized, that they could go in there and basically undo what our people did. So that was, to me, so encouraging, because you have, depending where you look and how you count, you certainly have at least 200 million, probably more like 300 million kids in this category. There is no school. So when there is no school, and I'm not advocating that you should have no school, but the time it takes to build the schools and train the teachers and do very traditional things is relatively long. So can the kids be doing some of it? And this is perhaps the best picture I have ever had of a project. It's not a great photograph as such, but this is a pretty extraordinary picture, because the kid on the right sort of nominated himself as teacher. The others are all doing different things, but look at the kid on the left leaning over using the tablet of the other, who in turn is leaning over using the tablet. It's actually quite a scene, and those kids today, they read. They're doing a lot of the things that it was always believed that you have to have, a schoolroom and a teacher and a classroom. And I point out that when school gets to this village, and when this think of it as like a cell phone system growing out in meeting these kids, these are going to be the most extraordinary. God, I'd love to be a teacher and have them in the class. So, as I said, I'm not advocating no school, but this is sure a way to create a literate world within a number that's rather short. By the way, a number of years. You could do it in 2 years if you wanted to really sit down with some resolve. And you can do it with, amounts of money that sound big but aren't that big when you compare them to other ways we spend money. So I've been focusing sort of since that project in sort of really in the telecommunications side of it. How do you connect these kids? Because the issue isn't really a laptop anymore. It isn't a tablet. Those are just plummeted. You can buy tablets for $49 these days. And again, the cell phone industry it helped a great deal. But in telecommunications, what's happened, which is sort of an irony, is that the phone companies, the cell phone companies, that have created this opportunity in the digital world have done it as a market, not a mission. And it's really a very interesting phenomenon, because there's I'll just give you by way of story. A little over a year and a half ago, I was one of the so-called keynote speakers at the Barcelona annual, whatever it's called, World Mobilecom, Telecom, the big annual event. And I showed some of these slides, showed things, and you could see the audience was absolutely sort of engrossed in it. They loved it. And then when I said that I thought that telecommunications should be a human right, you could hear a pin drop. And a question from the back of the room was, do you mean free? And I said, yes, I mean free. And a very unhappy audience. They're really, because the whole sort of market, forces is it's what's happening. People say, well, people are going to pay so much. Well, it's time to rethink that. It's time to rethink it very, very carefully. There's some that I won't start naming phone companies, but there are phone companies in the developing world that there's one last year that had $2 billion, they took in $2 billion, of which $1 billion was profit. And you say, wait a minute, there's something wrong with that picture. Because that extra billion, and I'm not against people making money or against capitalism, but if you're interested in development and economic development and growth and learning and eliminating poverty, that $1 billion is coming out of the system. It's not being put back into the system. And it doesn't make sense. And to me, and this is another thing that, especially in business schools, I hate the term sustainable. It drives me crazy because somebody says, well, we got to do a sustainable model. What do you mean a sustainable model? Sidewalks aren't sustainable. Road outside my house isn't sustainable. Okay, there's not a little meter there that then the rich people pay and the poor don't or something like that. It's part of civic society. So when people say, and I'll use satellites because I'm involved with satellites at the moment, somebody says, well, let's do a sustainable model where you launch the satellite, and half of it is used for commercial purposes, and the income of that half supports the other half of the satellite that is used for humanitarian and charitable purposes. Sounds pretty simple, pretty clear, and it is, quote, sustainable. The reason I don't like that model isn't so much the satellite example, but you're looking for it in a very tight loop. How is my little organization going to pay for itself while it does this and so? The opposite point of view, or should we say the other end of the spectrum, is that what you're doing elevates society, extricates people from poverty, they become working members of society, they generate income and some level of prosperity, and guess what? Much as we hate this, they pay taxes. There's nothing wrong with that. They pay taxes, then part of the sort of what civics, I certainly believe education is part of what civic society should be providing. And as a somewhat hypocritical side remark, the worst thing that's happened to public education in this country is private education. We can have that as a separate discussion. It's really a public obligation. And you've got, whether it's primary health services, whether it's, so it's a very, very different model when you then put telecommunications. Why on earth is the road outside your house part of that larger civic, responsibility, and yet the telecommunications isn't? It's the same reason that the hotel charges you for Wi-Fi but not for soap. They're just being stupid. That's the only reason. There's no difference between the soap and the Wi-Fi. In fact, it probably costs in an expensive hotel that you go to a Four Seasons, the soap you waste is more expensive than the Wi-Fi they charge you for. So you say, what? Well, all these things are kind of bizarre sort of inconsistencies. So I'm obviously not the most popular guy in the telecommunications industry, but I'll end on I'll end on the last one and then open it up for questions. Any questions, most provocative questions, the better. At this moment, there is no organization that deploys any kind of connectivity or telecommunications the way the World Food Program deploys food. The World Food Program feeds 30 million people a day. When there's conflict, they're usually the first in, the last out. They lose people every month or so. The driver is killed or something. They're really on the ground. They're deploying it. There's no equivalent for telecommunication. And you could do one. And you could do one pretty easily, except you got to do it probably within the UN, which makes it a little harder, but not impossible. And that's one of the things I'm working on slowly. So let me end there and see if we can, if I pushed any hot buttons, and you can then sort of ask that. So thank you very much. Some questions over here. I don't know if there's a mic, a couple.
Hi, Melissa Marsh. I'm CEO and CFO
Is there a
of
way of
Plastark.
shutting that light over there that's just, it's so blinding? Oh, I guess there's a TV camera. Okay.
I'm a Course 4 grad and want to get back to this question of 2 of the 50 PhDs doing philanthropic work. I also recently heard, don't have the citation for this, but 20% of Harvard grads signing up for Teach for America. And so I'm wondering if there's something missing in the pedagogy or things that we're thinking about that are kind of the mismatch between technology being for the good of the world.
I don't want to confuse, a philanthropic nonprofit life with big ideas. You can do big ideas in many ways, and you don't have to commit yourself to being a social entrepreneur or working for whatever, the church. I think you can do big ideas in many, many ways. When you see people signing up for something like Teach for America, which, as an aside, is one of the worst ideas in education that's come along in a long time. It and Khan Academy sort of are in first and second for bad ideas, which we can talk about if you want. But I think what that reflects, when I see it happening and happening at the Harvard Business School, is that there is now more than ever, let me tell it with a story. I meet people who retire from very successful careers in banking or whatever, investment banking, and they're in their sometimes late 50s, early 60s. You meet them at a cocktail party, now partly because they're talking to me, but they say, oh God, I got to tell you, about the Peace Corps. God, it was really the Peace Corps. I met my wife or husband in the Peace Corps, and now I'm going to do for the rest of my life something that has to do with meaning, not money. So what sort of happens in that kind of life is that you do something for money and then meaning. But what seems to be occurring, and that's why you get the 20% that go to Teach for America and do, is that decision that some of us felt we had to make about meaning and money is a little bit more porous. It's a little bit more like an omelet instead of a fried egg. You can kind of do both, and you can do things, and you get kids who, and the whole sort of social entrepreneurship and do it. It's much more, interconnected, and I think that's the good news. Not so much that we failed to get, enough people in the philanthropic world. It's the, I'm blocking on the word that I really want, but it's it's a much more porous, environment at this moment. And I'm glad you were in course 4. It's the greatest training for general education. For those of you who don't remember the number system, that's architecture. And I highly recommend that students today go to design school, actually even over business school, because in design school you learn the kinds of things that I think teach you about sort of how to look at the world very creatively and very differently. Now, there was a question in the back of the room over there that we can maybe get the mic to, and we have one over here that we can set up at the same time.
Thank you, Rex Salisbury. And I had a question about the role of assessment in philanthropy, specifically randomized controlled trials, and if any of that sort of methodology had been applied to one laptop per child. And I say that in a former life, I did an internship for Innovations for Poverty Action. You probably know Esther at MIT. So thank you.
Yeah. Now, I could have guessed that. Let me answer it at 2 levels. At the, whatever, 64,000 foot level. If you have to measure an impact, it probably wasn't worth doing. And I remember when I actually studied this stuff, something called the just noticeable difference. And if it's just noticeable, then yeah, there are many places that you might want to measure it and find the just noticeable difference. But I've always felt, and I used to say this to the National Science Foundation, if you have to measure the impact of this result, it wasn't big enough for you to be funding in the first place. And when I'm told with nonprofits that we are measurement-oriented, I say, God, you're wasting your time. Don't spend your time measuring, spend your time having a bigger impact. And I am the person that thinks that those randomized control trials, they're not a waste of time. I don't want to suggest that. But it's not where I want to spend my time, and I would like it to be that measurement is achieved through self-evidence. This is so self-evident. And when I can show you a picture of a school in Cambodia in whatever it was, 2001 or 2002, and then tell you that every single one of those children went to college, I guess that's measurement of some sort, because I can tell you every one, or maybe it's 8 out of 10 or whatever the number. But there's a certain level for which I think self-evidence should get more credit than it gets. And so I tend to be sort of, and I catch hell all the time from your people. Yeah. But I'm much better humored about it than I used to be. Are you raising your hand? Yeah. Yes, okay. So.
Yeah, in light of the discussions this morning about asking questions, so for the World Connectivity Organizations to happen, can you list a bunch of questions to ask? What's the bottleneck? What's required? There's a very large group of very powerful people here. Maybe we can put something together and get things started.
Sure. It's. Let me take it as an offer. I don't have a complete answer in the sense that it's not really about money. It's more about how do these big international organizations work. And the UN has its own particular characteristic. My older brother was the American ambassador for a number of years, so I got to see it from the inside, got to see it from the outside. And it moves very, very slowly. And then they get distracted. I mean, when things happening in Israel and things happening, with ISIS, it's kind of hard to say we should make a world. They're pretty preoccupied. But it's something that I think will happen naturally. It happened in the food domain because the FAO, for those of you who know about the UN, is the Food and Agriculture Organization. And it's an information and research organization. It's not a ground troops thing. So there is great precedent of having two entities unrelated to each other, they're not even the same branch of the UN, both work on food, but one's research and information and one is kind of mobilizing ground troops. What's a little bit different about the World Food Organization, when it feeds 30 million people, kids mostly, a day, is that those 30 million don't change constantly. So if you have a driver who's driving a truck, the driver can live in whatever Phnom Penh and drive the truck and then go home at night or at least get back, and it's this kind of a route to it. If you're deploying telecommunications, you're kind of going from one place to the next place to the next place. It's a little bit more nomadic. But that's where you could say, now we'll use postdocs, we'll use the gap year. Can you imagine if every kid in the United States had to take a gap year? Wouldn't that be extraordinary? Wouldn't that be a wonderful change? Everybody goes on a gap year, and this would be great. Put some of your kids in harm's way, but that's, at least, maybe it has to be older students, or graduates from, there are ways of thinking about it that could, I think, be very creative. I'll come back to you with that. Okay, I think I've probably run out of time, because I know unless there's one last question, which I'm not seeing because of the, yes, there's one question in the back of the room. So you have the burden of back corner. But the videotape won't hear you.
It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to hear you. You propose some very radical, fundamental ideas, right? Market forces work in certain cases, don't. Telecommunication should be a human right. So my question is very simple. How feasible do you think these are? I won't ask the viability question. I just say, do you think you can change beliefs widely enough that these things can actually happen sometime?
Clearly the answer is yes, because I just turned 70 last year, and you can sort of say to yourself, wow, I mean, how can you get to that, which used to be really old? Oh my God, somebody that was 70, I mean, I used to think, why are you alive at that age? And now, we're kids. But you get to there, and you then think, well, obviously it was optimism and many things. I can't tell you how many things in my life that people have told me were so stupid. I'll give you one that actually recently has been going around the internet. This was just before we built the Media Lab. No, maybe it was actually 8 years before the Media Lab. We were developing the first touch-sensitive displays. And people wrote scientific articles, peer-reviewed. Peer review as a concept sucks. Peer-reviewed article on why fingers are the wrong input device. 1, your hand occludes the screen. 2, they're low resolution. And 3, which was the winner, it gets the screen dirty. Okay. Literally. And people, I remember hosting a Kresge event when somebody came up to me and said, boy, really loved what you showed today, except that fingers thing. What's this about fingers? And many years later, that's the interface that we all use now. So I've gone through about 30 or 40 of those in my life. And I'm fond of telling people, and this again comes from age, that you say things like, in 10 years this will happen. Well, guess what? In 10 years, I'm here and I'm around and I'm looking and I'm saying, well, did it happen? Did it not? And it often did. And then you say, well, in 10 years, this will happen. And at times, those things that you say seem so crazy, and they say, how can you possibly say that? And then it happens. So I feel kind of I've been to the future many times, you know, because you say this, and then the future comes, and then it's the present, and then you do it again. And you go through that. I was pushed to the extreme, and this is perhaps a good way to end. I gave the first TED Talk and gave 14 TED Talks thereafter on the main stage and about 10 TEDx's. And so I've done TED Talks since the inception of TED. In fact, I was very much part of the inception. And they asked me this year to come, because it was the 30th anniversary, to kick off the TED with a talk really about what had transpired and about why the predictions had come out pretty good. And I said, and then they said, oh, will you make a prediction? And so I said, no, I said, those weren't predictions. Nothing that I said in 1985, which was the first TED, were predictions. They were all extrapolations. We just took what we were doing and, you know, go a little further, you know. So you just extrapolate. Extrapolation is a lot easier. And it's something that, you know, you can do with a little bit more confidence. Dear friends of mine, people like Alvin Toffler, would read stuff and assimilate it, and I had great admiration for what he did, and then he would synthesize and predict something. I don't think I ever did that. So I get off the main stage this year, and they say, wait a minute, got to come back, you didn't make your prediction. So I was sort of a little annoyed. I had prepared this, it wasn't quite out of the blue, and I thought this was a way to get an extra couple of minutes on the stage to have them call you back for your prediction. And I said, well, I predict that we will learn languages by swallowing pills. And that the way you will learn it is that the pill will go into your bloodstream through, it's a kind of an inefficient way to get into the bloodstream. A needle would be better, but I thought injecting it was a little over the top. So you'd swallow it, and it would go in, and these little robots would find where they should put the various parts of English, and you would then speak English. Now, it turns out that this isn't so stupid, that in 30 years you will ingest information, whether it's you're getting James Joyce, or you're getting a language, or you're getting something. But the point is, it's a prediction. And that's where, you know, it gets people talking, and it got me 3 extra minutes on the stage. Thank you. Thank you very much. Hi. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It was wonderful. Now, we stand between you and the cocktail hour. We're very aware of that, so we'll be really brief. I'm Remy with T3 Advisors, and I want to briefly introduce my colleague and CEO of T3 Advisors, Roy Hirschland. Roy has also recently won this year the Entrepreneur of the Year, so we're really excited to have him here with us today.
Thanks, Remy. We are going to go right to cocktails, but I wanted just to, first of all, thank Jeremy and Jack for letting us switch our sponsorship from the coffee hour to the cocktail hour, aligning with strengths. And most importantly, this is about the future forward CFO, and just take a second to recognize what an extraordinary year we've had here in Boston. I travel a lot to our West Coast offices, and I think sometimes here in Boston we talk a lot about what's happening in Silicon Valley. But we need to remember we have a wonderful thing going on here in this innovation economy, and it's been an incredible year. We've had 20 IPOs, over $2 billion worth of equity raised versus 12 the year before and 8 the year before that. So it's been an incredible year. I'd like to ask if John Kinzer is still in the room, and Jim Hall, and TS Ramesh to come up on stage. We're lucky to have 3 of the CFOs who worked hard to go public this year. You know, when companies in the Boston area are sold to companies from elsewhere, we lose a bit of the heart and soul of this community. Companies that are based here give to our charities, give to our schools and our hospitals and our cultural institutions, and they hire our friends and our neighbors. And so on behalf of everyone here in this room, I want to recognize Imprivata and Jim Hall, VP of Finance, Wayfair, TS Ramesh with Head of Global Controller, and finally, related to MIT, John Kinzer and HubSpot. Congratulations to the 3 of you. What a wonderful year. Congrats, man. Thanks, Jim. So who in the audience is out there that's going to be up here next year? But we hope this is going to be a tradition going forward. And to recognize, again, how important it is that you guys decided to stay based here and go public, we're going to make a donation to Build Boston, which is an organization helping build entrepreneurship in the most disadvantaged public schools in Boston. We're going to make a donation on behalf of your companies. So, and I'm going to personally bring one of the students and the director over to your companies to meet everybody. So sort of in Olympic speak, Jeremy and Jack, I hope I'm okay in saying this, I do declare the 2014 MIT CFO conference closed, and may the cocktail hour begin. Thanks, guys. Thanks, John.